Deuteronomy chapter 32, I'm reading from verse 8 onwards. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, here not the sons of Israel, but the sons of man, there was a separation. There was a division that was made. When he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the people. That's basically the boundaries of the nations. God is the one who sets the boundaries to nations. Now, we don't see it in a sense, his working, but he certainly works in the background. He is very actively working in the spiritual realm. As we looked a couple of weeks back, the spiritual realm is not viewable with our physical eyes. We tend to see everything in the physical realm, but not in the spiritual realm. We detect the spiritual things through spiritual means. Jesus said, my words are spirit and life. So this word can spiritually impart insight into us. The Holy Spirit himself can give us illumination. The spirit of prophecy. Jesus' spirit is a spirit of prophecy, giving us understanding. So spiritual things are detected by spiritual means. Of course, we can look at the news and we can understand the things that are going on in the physical realm. That is only one side of it. But to really get a grasp and insight, to perceive what is going on, right? To perceive what is going on, we surely need the spiritual realm also, an understanding of the spiritual realm, because everything happens in the spiritual realm first before it happens in the physical realm. In a sense, what happens in the physical realm is a reflection of what is going on in the spiritual realm. God is the one who separated the people. God is the one who set boundaries to the peoples. But he did it based on something. There were some other considerations that he had in his mind. And what was this? He set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. So that boundaries were set according to the number of the sons of Israel. It was based on Israel. Right? Israel was the center, the apple of his eye. And based on Israel, he set the boundaries for other nations. In the prophetic book of Jeremiah, if I'm not wrong, in Ezekiel, chapter 38 and 39, God calls Israel the center of the earth. His land, the center of the earth. In another place, it's called the navel of the earth. Because it's very important to our Lord. It is very important to our Lord. Monachande, I think the mic is on. Huh? For the Lord's portion is his people. Lord has a portion in this world. Amongst the people in the Old Testament, Lord's portion was the children of Israel. Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. So based on that, God gave Jacob his people, God's inheritance, a lot in this world, and that was Israel, the land of Israel. And that land belongs to him, that land belongs to the Lord, and he gave it to the people of Israel. Then he told the other nations to take the other regions. So remember one thing, even in nations, in the boundaries of nations, God is the one who establishes those boundaries. Now, when we come to the New Testament, Paul, when he speaks, Acts chapter 17, when he speaks in Athens, again, he gives us an idea. He looks, remember the apostles looked at matters from a spiritual perspective. And we also should and force ourselves to see things spiritually. Because that is the difference between us and the world. But we cannot, come to a conclusion in our own ways without a foundation from the scriptures. The scriptures should be the foundation upon which we come to a spiritual understanding. Acts chapter 17, here Paul is talking to the Athenians. This is called the Sermon on Mars Hill. He says, verse 23 onwards, let me read. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. Verse 24. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. Since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. Verse 26, and he made from one man. Humanity started from one man. This is the spiritual understanding. If you go to a classroom, a typical classroom, they will say, humanity started from a frog or a ape. Now, there in itself, we have a contradiction. Spiritual people would have immediately a contradiction. Though we will go along to get along, yes. Yeah, we are not immediately going to condemn the teacher because we will just forgive their ignorance. Right? We will not condemn the teacher immediately. Neither are we going to go against it because we just go along to get along. Which is fine, which is okay. We don't have to raise the scriptures everywhere. Right? Don't throw the pearls amongst the swines. But the fact of the matter is, the spiritual understanding is this: God started humanity from one man. Okay, not only that, he made from one man every nation of mankind. So not only did he start humanity from one man, he also started all nations from that one man, which means groups of people. Groups of people from that one man. For what? To live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed time. So even understand one thing, even nations have an appointed time. Babylon had an appointed time. Then came the Medo-Persian Empire and swallowed up Babylon. Then you had this Medo-Persia had an appointed time. Then the Greeks came and swallowed up Medo-Persia. Right. And then, of course, the Greeks also had an appointed time. The Romans came and swallowed up the Greek Empire. Likewise, you see the Dutch Empire in the 1500s. You see the rise of the Dutch Empire, which was swallowed by the English Empire, which was later in the new century, in the 19th and 20th century, was swallowed by the American Empire. Because God has determined not only the nations that should exist, but also the boundaries to the nations. Here he says, having determined their appointed times, he is the one who appoints times, and the boundaries of their habitation. We think that we human beings are the ones who set the boundaries. No, God is the one who sets the boundaries. If Putin is successful in this matter, it is because God wants the boundaries to be extended and established. Of course, he may be motivated by a demonic being, no doubt about it, but God's purposes are even fulfilled. God does his work even through false prophets, through Satan. His purposes cannot be frustrated. Remember, God is playing a 10-dimensional chess game. And we human beings have a great difficulty in playing this in one dimension. No, I would say God is playing this probably in the 10⁶ dimension. Right? Satan is playing this game at a higher level than human beings. But the fact of the matter is, as Job understood, your purposes cannot be frustrated. Your hand cannot be turned. This is what he says about the Lord. God will be glorified anywhere and everywhere at his time of his choosing, in the place that he determines. That is why we praise, worship, and honor him, because he is our God and our Father. So, if we do not have a spiritual understanding of what is going on, God expands the boundaries of nations. He realigns nations according to his will. Now, if Putin is successful, I do not know whether Putin is going to be successful. We do not know. We can pontificate, but who knows? Ultimately, we will know. If he fails, it is because God has determined it in that way. Right? So expanding boundaries and decreasing in boundaries, a nation becoming nothing, or a society becomes nothing, becoming nothing, is all determined by the Lord. By the way, does the Lord capriciously decide, you know what, yeah, America, let America go, boom? No. Oh, let Israel just go. Now it's time for the Medo-Persians to come up. No, it is basically existing nations are judged so that the new nations will come up. Right? That is how nations are turned off and turned on. Because the existing nations become so proud, they become so heavily armed, right? They start pushing and pushing other subservient nations. And naturally, what is going to happen is God is going to bring his judgment in his own ways. Having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. Why? For what purpose? That they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far away from us. Though he is not far away from us. God is very near, but man in his sinful heart, with the height of depravity in him, cannot find him. But God is very near. He is very near to humanity. But we fashion our own ways and we fashion our own, kind of things, societies and nations, and they go after their own ways. Finally end up in trouble. So, let us understand one thing. On whichever side we fall, whether we fall on this, whether we stand with Putin, or whether we stand with the Ukrainians, of course. I don't think many are there to stand with Putin. Okay. But the hypocrisy of the West, to me especially, the hypocrisy of the West is, it's kind of unbearable. Okay. The hypocrisy of the West is unbearable. Remember one thing, the way in which Putin is waging war is surely atrocious. He is a war criminal, for no doubt. There's no doubt about it. But to basically say that, hold on just a second. But to say that John Mearsheimer, on why West is principally responsible for the Ukrainian crisis. Of course, the way in which Putin is waging the war, right, he's surely a terrorist and a culprit, no doubt about it. But you know what? That is what has been going on for the major part of history. Read the Mongolians, read about the Mongols, read about the Romans, read about the Greeks. The Greeks were a little bit more milder. What about the Assyrians and the Babylonians? So then some people will ask, aren't we living in modern generation? Aren't we living in modern times? How can we wage war like this? Oh, really? We are living in modern times? Really? When millions of babies are put into garbage dumps every day and blood is flowing like rivers, I again and again bring this up because we should not be blinded. Because these people who call out this to be a great atrocity against human beings, of course it is. Some of the videos that we see is unbearable. But we need to see the other videos also, what is going on day and night in this country. Now, they would try to say, well, that is worse than this. No, these are hypocrites. And all these are a bunch of hypocrites. They bring up the video of how Putin bombed the medical ward, the mother and baby ward of the hospital. Of course, it's gruesome. No doubt about it. But do you know in New York, in the New York Assembly, in New York State, or in New Jersey, the governor was actually cheering for babies after being birthed and viable on the table. They were thinking of bringing laws to kill the baby on the table, even though the baby is viable to live. And they were making a big case about it. That was in New Jersey, the New Jersey governor. On the other hand, in New York, the whole assembly, I think it's just like California, They have a supermajority. The Democrats have a supermajority, and they were all shouting out in loud voices because of the extreme abortion laws that they have passed. And these are the people who are calling Putin a war criminal. Of course he is a war criminal. But what about them? Do you think God distinguishes death in some other ways? In fact, the death of the innocent is much more worse. Or the death of the innocent is much more worse. So if you ask me personally, of course, and when I see these videos, it is heartbreaking. I don't know how the world is going to deal with him. And he's gone mad, to be very frank. But these people who, in the West, who look to be very cultured and, they are all painted in their faces and they look really, empathetic and sympathetic, and their righteous and just act and speech about what is going on in Ukraine, while in their own doorsteps, when they have power in their hands to stop all these things, they in fact allow and secretly fund this kind of stuff. Do you know Planned Parenthood, in the last bill that was passed, was given a huge amount of money, if I'm not wrong, about $1 billion, to continue abortion in the name of women's health? Who are they kidding? Of course they can fool Americans, but certainly not God. The Lord sees everything. So the West in itself is at a precipice. Just like our Lord said to the nation Israel, I'm fashioning a disaster against you. And I think the Lord is fashioning a disaster against the West. He's the one who brought the Assyrians. God doesn't care about our modernity and how we wage war in modern times. In secrecy, blood is flowing in every country. Innocent are being killed. Money is being spent, American money is being spent to kill babies in other nations. Right? So we cannot look justice partially. We should not look. Of course, when we see some things. But I think we should have a spiritual understanding of what is going on. We need to have a bigger picture. Nations are in a turmoil. And one nation is going after the other. God is the one who establishes the boundaries. And this is how boundaries are expanded. Have you ever noticed? It's always after a war. Boundaries are expanded. Nation becomes bigger after a war. No nation has increased its boundaries in peacetime. Right? In history, look at history. It's always after a war, nations' boundaries are redrawn. If nations have to redraw their boundaries, they have to go to war. They have to go to war. This present system that they are talking about, which is the American world order that was established after the Second World War, and the economic order which was established after the Bretton Woods Agreement, right? And the shipping and all these, commerce and buying and selling that was established by the American sea lanes and American Navy. All this is part of the present world order. And the nations and the boundaries were also established by the present order. Now here is a man who wants to change this order. Not only him, China, India. I don't think India wants to change the order, the present order. But certainly China does. And surely Putin does, because he's been talking about this for years now. Years, decades. He's been screaming against this matter, that this is a unipolar world where the United States is the boss in the world. Even today or yesterday, he's basically said, we are going to teach the United States something. We are going to put them in their place. That's what he's saying. Now, by the way, is the Lord on our side? I don't think so. With the corruption and things that are going on, America is seeding other nations. If you really look at the international relationships, it's seeding other nations with all sorts of corruption. Can you believe in Afghanistan? In Kabul University, they had transgender studies. And the LGBTQ flag, posted and pasted there. In Afghanistan, that is the main thing in Afghanistan. That's what they went to do. Now, if you have a spiritual eye to these matters, you'll understand, okay, this is not going to go good. God is turning things around. Of course, Putin is doing his thing. He's not going to escape either. Right? But understand one thing. It is God who brought up the Assyrians, who were very wild and wicked. If you go to one of these museums which have Assyrian historic items, reliefs, you see how gruesome they were with respect to dealing with their enemies. They would go capture a city and then they would take people, cut their stomach, put live cats inside the stomach and stitch it back. The Romans would crucify people, right? When after the rebellion in Jerusalem in AD 70, the road outside Jerusalem on both sides, men were crucified for miles. Who do you think brought the Romans to Jerusalem? Satan brought them to Jerusalem? No, God himself brought them to Jerusalem. Because there's a time when man will be judged for his actions. Even a worldly person will be judged. Only God knows the inner secrets of a nation. Only God knows the inner secret of a nation. He's the one who brought the Assyrians. He's the one who brought the Romans. He's the one who brought the Babylonians. So with a spiritual eye, if you look at this, well, he's the one who's doing this also. Why? Because it's a judgment. Of course, all wars are judgment, no doubt about it. All wars are judgment. Even when Israel was asked to go into the land of Canaan and destroy the people there, you know what God said? God told Abraham, it is not a time for this people to be judged. So, at their time, when the judgment, when their sin is filled in the cup, they will be judged. And those were the days, which is the days of Joshua, when God judged Canaan. So there's a time. God always gives nations a time. But once his judgment starts rolling, there is no way out of it. There is no way out of it. So we need to see this from a spiritual perspective. All the nations are but a drop in the bucket. That's what the psalmist says about the people of the world, the nations of the world. Therefore, we, the spiritual people, should understand this from a spiritual perspective. Of course, we have political perspectives and we lean politically one way or the other. We think that if Trump was here, this wouldn't have happened. That's exactly the reason why Trump is not here, if you think so. God is even the God of Trump. Trump is just a breath. Whichever man rules the United States, we are just breathing human beings. That's about it. God's purposes will be fulfilled. If he decides judgment should come, judgment will come. None of us can stop it. So John Mershimer on the West, he says principally West is responsible for this war. The war in Ukraine is the most dangerous international conflict since 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Understanding its root causes is essential if you are to prevent it from getting worse and instead to find a way out to bring it to a close. And he is extremely right. You know what? He is a professor at Chicago University. Go look at his videos in YouTube. He's been saying this from 2014 onwards. He's been saying again and again and again, don't press Putin, don't press Putin, don't. And we've been just, doing anything and everything in Ukraine for the last 4-5 years, isn't it? There is no question that Vladimir Putin started the war and is responsible for how it is being waged exactly. But why he did so is another matter. West is the reason for this. So here is the nation of Ukraine being, the bear is tearing it apart. No, if you look at if you had an understanding of what was going on in Syria, this is exactly what he's doing in Ukraine also. As far as the things that Putin is doing, it's not a new thing. It is new to us because we started noticing these things. But this is exactly what he was doing in Syria. He would just go into a city, he will flatten the city. Aleppo was the most populated city in Syria. What did he do? He just flattened it because he doesn't want his soldiers to be killed. And he knows that all these, all the soldiers are where? All the terrorists are amongst the population. And he doesn't want his soldiers to go in and get killed. So the only thing to do is what? Just barrel bomb the whole city. Right? Even in Kiev, the soldiers are amongst the population. Ukrainian soldiers are amongst the population. They have taken a insurgency methodology to prevent defend their country. And what he did in Syria is exactly what he's doing in Ukraine. But nobody had any problem when he did it in Syria. Of course, the West made a lot of noise about it, but still we moved on without a problem because those are Arabs. Now suddenly it is at our doorstep. Ukraine is West, right? It's Europe. And so there's a great concern. Ukraine is, it's a sad situation, to be very frank. The largest nation inside Europe is being torn apart. But there's a surprising thing that is happening. And notice this particular video and the other foils that are coming, or the other pictures that come. And can you tell me what is peculiar about this man? About what is happening to him?
You don't have the floor. President. In the long history of the British Parliament, there has never been a moment like this. A wartime president speaking a foreign language beamed into the House of Commons from a city under siege. Zelensky's speech was a day-by-day recount of Russian escalation, a calendar of shelled cities, shattered lives, and dead children. 50 children have been killed, he says. They could have lived, but these people have taken them from us. And so a plea for Great Britain to live up to the greatness in its name. Zelensky compared Ukraine's resistance to the British defiance of the Nazis, referencing Winston Churchill by promising to fight Russia on the sea and in the air.
President Volodymyr Zelensky is standing firm for democracy and for freedom. In his righteous defense, I believe he has moved the hearts of everybody in this house.
It may have moved hearts, but it didn't change minds, at least not on Ukraine's central demand. Again, Zelensky called for a NATO-enforced no-fly zone, a repeated plea that has been repeatedly denied, no matter the casualties, because NATO is desperate to avoid a widening war.
We will employ every method that we can, diplomatic, humanitarian, and economic, Mr. Speaker, until Vladimir Putin has failed.
Labour stands for the toughest sanctions that will cripple the Russian state.
So MPs rose for one last round of applause as night fell on Ukraine on day 13 of the Russian attack. Johnson's defense secretary will announce new measures to help Ukraine on Wednesday. It will include further military aid and suggestions as to how other allies can help, but it will not include a no-fly zone. David Cochran, CBC News, London.
So here is Zelensky speaking to the UK Parliament. Zelensky invokes 9/11 Pearl Harbor in plea to US Congress for a no-fly zone. Zelensky tells German MPs never again Holocaust slogan is now meaningless. Preparations underway for Zelensky Knesset speech amidst fears of low MK turnout. Now he's going to speak to Israeli parliament also. He has already spoken to whom? Well, sorry, the picture is behind. But he's already spoken to the EU Parliament. Here is a leader who is speaking to peoples of different nations. Right? This man, a Jewish man, who is being wounded now, he's wounded, or he's being wounded. He's speaking to nations, and amongst nations, and especially in the West, he's considered to be a great man, a powerful man. Do you see a similarity of this man with another man, which is the man of lawlessness? I'm not saying Zelensky is the Antichrist, but I'm just saying, see how the nations are willing to accept him. This is the first time. There are many firsts in this matter. Especially, as far as a joint session of US Congress, there have been other leaders, but UK, it has not happened. And that too, in these many countries, addressing the parliament is basically addressing the people. And he's loved and favored in all these countries, except for the East. Again, let me clarify one thing. I'm not saying that Zelensky is the Antichrist. I'm just saying, see what is going on. In the future, this is not impossible. This is kind of a shadow of what is written in the scriptures. A man who speaks to many nations and who's loved by many nations. But he's being wounded. Hopefully you understand the picture. Now this is another turn of events. I remember one thing, Germany was the cause for the First World War. Germany was the cause for the Second World War. So the Allies decided, after the First World War, the major powers in those days decided, you know what, we should not allow Germany to be a major power. And so they put heavy burdens upon Germany, both economic as well as military burdens. They couldn't have an army. They could just have an internal civil defense, and that's about it. And Hitler came and basically said, you know what, this is too much for us to bear. They kind of cheated us in the peace treaty, and he turns it all around. And Second World War is the outcome of it. So after the Second World War, again the Allies gathered together, and as far as the agreement, the peace treaty with Germany was concerned, Germany will never have an army, or would have a small set of, a small paramilitary force or something of that sort. Instead, German security will be guaranteed by the Allies. That was the agreement. Moreover, Germans, especially East Germans, they've been pacifist. Because of their history. Because of their history in the Second World War, they've been against war and they've been against having a military till this time. So this big thing that is happening right now, Germany being militarized, is an important event. One thing with Germany is this: once they start to do something, they are very efficient and they get their things done. That is why they've been the cause of major wars. Right? Because once they get strong and powerful, they have the sense to take over things. Or a powerful leader will come up who will take over things. Germany is the largest and the most powerful economy in Europe right now. So you just unleash the Germans and they will surely come up to be something. A big defense budget shows Germany has woken up. Olaf Scholz is serious about helping Europe face down Vladimir Putin. Germany's post-war pacifism was once comforting to its neighbors and to Germans themselves. Yet, with the passing of the generations, attitudes have shifted. Sensible Europeans long ago stopped seeing Germany as a threat. On the contrary, the passivity of its foreign policy has in recent years posed more of a danger by encouraging aggressors such as Vladimir Putin. At last, Mr. Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has convinced Germans to take security seriously. As Olaf Scholz's first budget makes clear, Germany is preparing to pull its weight. The task for Germany's new chancellor is to make sure that the effort is sustained, effective, and encompasses risk sharing as well as just cash splurging. He's going to spend a lot of money on building his military, arms and ammunition. If Germany has taken this way, Europe will once again be prominent in the world history. It's only a matter of time. If Germany starts building armaments and weapons, surely English are going to do the same thing too. If the English are going to do the same thing, already the French are doing it, so the French is also going to. French already has a sizable and a good army right now. Right? And they are selling their weapons to different parts of the world. Why is it significant to us? Because there is an understanding that the Antichrist or the people of the Antichrist or the Antichrist will come from Europe. Which means that Europe has to be prominent because the Antichrist is a man of war. Right? Not only is he a man of war, he's a man of diplomacy also. Within Europe, he's a man of diplomacy. Just like the Romans, right? The Romans were very diplomatic. If you don't challenge them, they will live with you. Though they conquer you, they will learn to live with you. They were very, helpful to new nations. Don't challenge them. They were very diplomatic. They understood that if you capture and if you conquer new nations and force them to be Romans, they are not going to give their religion or their customs. So they said, the Romans told the nations that they conquered, you live the way in which you want, only give us the tax and you're part of Romana. Okay. If you want to be a Roman citizen, you can. But you belong to us. But have your own religion, have your own culture, have your own way of living. They gave people the freedom. That kind of a man is again coming. Right? That kind of a man is again coming. Anyways, this news is important because if Germany starts doing this, Europe will start doing this. By the way, Germans till now were pacifist. Because of their history, because of Hitler in the Second World War and what they did in Second World War, they didn't want to deal with war anymore. At least the generations were brought up like that. So NATO was underwriting their security till now. NATO was underwriting security. But there's a reason why Trump became president. You know why? Because he is the one who restarted, right? In the last 30 years, probably he is the president who kind of started pushing and pulling nations. He started prodding nations. Because he said, it is not our responsibility to basically take care of you. You need to put up 2% of your GDP if you want us to secure you. And so remember, before the election, he was making a big noise about how useless NATO is and how other countries are gypping the United States because the United States is putting out all the money to protect the European countries. But there's a reason for that, right? Because it was an agreement that was done during the Second World War. But still, under NATO, you still had to give 2% of your GDP towards defense. But America was not getting it from the European nations. Instead, what were the European nations doing? They were using that money to feed their people, live a lavish life, right? Out of 12 months, you only have to work 9 months. In some places in Italy, you have 3 months vacation. Then you had lifelong, while the Americans are, sweating, and Social Security out here is losing money. Europeans were basically having good times in their villas and in their beaches. And their old people were taken care of, and they were sitting in clubs, they were sitting in tea shops and coffee shops and, procuring pensions from their government. Because they were not putting any money for defense, because defense is the largest expense, isn't it? So Trump came and said, Europeans, you need to put forth your money. If you want us to underwrite your security, put 2% of your GDP. After his election, one of the first person to come and meet him was German premier, just forgot her name, the last premier. Just forgot her name. Now she is the first person to come to meet Trump. Anybody remember her name? Merkel, exactly, Merkel. Merkel is the first one to come and meet him at the White House. You know what she did? She gave a lecture to Trump. This is not how you deal with your allies, and this is not how you deal with Europe. This is this is how it has been, and she gave him a lecture. It is said that Trump quietly heard it, and it's unbelievable as he just kept on hearing it. But it is said that Trump just quietly heard it. And then, as Merkel was getting up to leave, she was waiting in the other room after talking to the president. And one of the undersecretaries took a bill for about $25 billion, right? A bill for $25 billion and gave it to Merkel and said, these are your arrears for the past years. Please pay it. So Trump was pretty serious. But what is going on? God is fulfilling his purpose because this guy, the Antichrist, is to come from this place. They have to be militarized once again. Now, Trump may be doing it out of greed or whatever. But if we don't have a spiritual insight into these matters, we will not understand it. We'll just take it political. Right? God is the one who gives peace to nations. But then, if you start killing and if blood starts flowing in your streets every night and day, and you're using your money to kill the innocent, then God is going to fashion disaster against you. Because a nation cannot go with unpunished with these kind of activities. Nearly 2.8 million birds, of course we didn't hear any of these things. Mostly chicken and turkeys have died in the first months of America's raging new bird flu pandemic. Of course, we are eating chickens, but 2.8 million birds since the start of the year have died. On top of everything else, now a highly pathogenic avian influenza pandemic is ripping across the United States, and it is already resulting in deaths of almost 2.8 million birds. So add to your chicken fund more money, because to eat chicken will be expensive. Most of the birds that have died have been chickens or turkeys. And since this was just in the very first month of the pandemic, there's no telling how bad it could eventually become. There are a lot of other things going on around the world, to be very frank. A lot of other things. But, this has been our focus. The West has been our focus. But to understand things in a spiritual way, what I do is I basically take a snippet of what is going on. We should be able to understand these things spiritually. Finally, the understanding should be spiritual. All nations belong to the Lord. The boundaries of nations are drawn by the Lord. Of course, it's always after a war or a global war or a regional war, the nations are the boundaries are established. But God decides who wins that war and who doesn't win the war. So then God is basically capriciously or in a bad intent trying to, because he wants to change the boundaries of the nations. He's just making nations to fight at each other. Well, what kind of a God is that? No, all wars are judgments. They are judgments. Because the prominent nations, the powerful nations, they become proud and rich. They become oppressive, because that's what always the rich does. A rich nation will oppress other nations. And so God will fashion disaster against that nation. War happens, right? Another country or nation becomes prominent, and they are given power to redraw nations. And so this is how the Lord does things. Okay? There is an aspect of judgment in this. There's an aspect of, questioning the West in this. Actually, this war between, or this conquest that Putin is trying to do, actually this is a war between philosophies. There's a Western philosophy, and then there is that Eastern Russian philosophy. And Russia is basically saying, we don't really care. That's exactly what they are doing. We don't care for you. Your Western philosophy, I think it was in 2016 or 2017, Putin said once, the liberal order is over. He's been saying this for a long time. We shouldn't be surprised that this is happening, because he's been saying this for a long time. Right? But it's just that the West didn't believe him. Or they thought that he would not do anything because he just keeps on speaking, and that's about it. So, don't believe the media in the West saying that, Putin's war is not going. This is how Putin, conducts his war. Of course, there has been a lot of problems. Of course, there has been a lot of problems in Ukraine for Putin, no doubt about it. It was not like Syria. But anyways, the fact that he's destroying cities is exactly what he did in Syria. It's exactly what he did in Syria. He used chemical weapons in Syria, or at least that's what's being said. And so the fact that he may use it here also is true. But there was no consequence in Syria, or, sanctions here and there. So, God will finish his work, because in this aspect there's an aspect of judgment also. And he decides which nation goes up and which nation goes down. And so from an end time perspective, how do we see this? Remember, when we put everything together, 2 years of pandemic, then the social issues that have come up afterwards, and this war now, and the fact that the whole world is in a stress actually because of this, is all an indication of the fact that, we are surely coming to those days just before the 7-year time period, which is called the tribulation period. Well, though you cannot call the whole 7 years as tribulation, but generally it is called the tribulation time period. Let the Lord enable us and strengthen us and bless us. Praise the Lord. Any questions?